Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Don't Risk It podcast presented by VFIS Client Risk Solutions. This program focuses on the exposures our clients frequently encounter and discusses some potential solutions to help reduce these exposures. I'm your host, Chris Rogers with VFIS Client Risk Solutions, and today we're discussing vehicle response guidelines for emergency service organizations. I want to welcome the entire team today. I have Mike Baker, Blair Tyndall, Dave Bradley, and Brian DeQuinn on the program. They're all members of the Client Risk Solutions team, and they're here to discuss some best practices to consider when developing response guidelines for your organization. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Always a pleasure, Chris.
Thank you all. So, Dave, I'm going to start the questions off with you. Is it important for an ESO to have written SOPs regarding vehicle operations?
Chris, that's an excellent place to start. It's absolutely important for organizations to have all parts of their operations in a written format of some sort, policies, protocols, procedures. Specific to vehicle operations, you want every operator of your vehicles to understand what is respected and what leadership wants them to do when operating the vehicles. So it provides a template and a good guidance for initial training, initial orientation and training, whether volunteer or career, ongoing driver training. With this group sitting here, we all believe that annually you should review your policies, and having them in written form lets everybody understand what the expectation is.
Also, Dave, our sample EVRS guidelines also have a place for the individual to sign that they've received a copy of those, so that helps to reiterate that part of it.
And I think it's important to note that really we should be reevaluating those every year, 2 years, 3 years with some regularity, that we're evaluating, making sure that it's still compliant, still the intended purposes, it's still meeting all of the best practices that exist in the emergency services.
So what are some key components to consider when establishing guidelines for your organization?
I'd say the first part is we'll hit on one of the big losses that we have here at Gladfelder or VFIS is intersection practices. I mean, you have to have written policies and procedures with how you want your folks to handle those intersections. Stop at each lane, treat each lane as a separate intersection, change the siren cadence, stop, 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 stop. Those are all things that need to be in there in a written format to educate your folks as to how to handle those intersections.
I think with that, we also need to make sure that the organizations that are using those preemptive devices or Opticom style devices, we need to make sure that that is in our policies as well, and we educate on that. There's too many people that think that that is the green light go and just go through those intersections with zero due regard. Because the light's green, they think that it's okay, not realizing that that light has cycled through way quicker than what people intended it to or anticipated it to. So that is something absolutely that needs to be covered in that policy and needs to be educated and re-educated on annually.
Also, our guidelines give a great place to start in our training as well, but educating your drivers as to what the different kinds of intersections are. Controlled intersections, uncontrolled intersections. So that's more stuff to define inside of the EVRS guidelines, and another good reason for them to be trained and to verify by signature that they've received that training.
And just to add on to that, the different kinds of intersections that are in your response area. So, the very simple controlled intersection. It's got a red light. It's got a stop sign. Uncontrolled. But you also think about railroad crossings, unguarded railroad crossings, those kind of things. Write the policy to your response area.
What about backing? I mean, we pay plenty of claims on striking fixed objects. Is backing an important component of the guidelines?
Yes, it most certainly is, Chris. As we know here at Gladfelder, our number one type of claim is striking fixed objects, and a majority of those result in backing incidences. So having a solid spotter program, having a solid spotter SOG, and making sure everyone understands the importance of it. And also, the downside of that is enforcing that policy as well. If you see someone that's not following the backing policy, or they, repetitively break that policy, then you need to address that inside the organization.
Well, and I think it's important to make sure that we're using a spotter, but understand that you're not always going to have that ability for a spotter. So getting out of the vehicle, doing a 360, evaluating your obstacles, seeing what's around you, making sure that where you're going is where you intend to go, making sure that everything is truly the best situation possible is absolutely an important key aspect to remember.
And, just going off of that, if you think about, Brian mentioned a circle of safety from a backing standpoint, but what a great place to start at the beginning of your policy that talks about a circle of safety prior to getting in that vehicle and moving it initially for a response or just for a normal flow of traffic run. Just getting out, or before you get in the vehicle, walk around the entire vehicle and make sure everything's clear.
And we can even expand the spotter concept from the backing policy. And let's go into just striking fixed objects or slow maneuvering of that vehicle. A spotter isn't necessarily just something for backing. If you're in a tight, fixed area, spotters should be considered for those areas as well, because like Blair had said, the number one claim we see from a frequency standpoint here is striking fixed objects.
Not all of our organizations are career organizations. We have plenty of volunteer departments. So how about POVs being integrated into those guidelines?
I think it's a good conversation because we do have a lot of insureds that rely heavily on privately owned vehicle responses. And it's important that we do a couple of different things. And first is making sure that we educate our people on what they are allowed to do in that personally owned vehicle. If you're in a state that allows blue lights or blue and red lights or whatever that courtesy light is within your area, making sure that they understand that it's just that, it's a courtesy, and understand that they have no ability to go over the posted speed limits, making sure that they have to follow all the traffic laws as they're intended. But even going deeper into that, evaluate how that person drives their personal vehicle, because oftentimes how they drive that personal vehicle is how they're going to drive your fire apparatus or EMS vehicle, if not worse, because they don't own it, they don't insure it, it's not their problem. And making sure that we get some type of validation or proof of their own personal insurance.
Absolutely, Brian. I will say this, that in my mind, POVs is probably one of the most under-recognized exposures for any emergency service organization out there. If you think of you run, 1,000 calls a year and you have 10 responders come to your station or go to the scene and their POVs, you have a much higher number of responses that you as a chief or leader in your organization are responsible for. And this area certainly needs the attention.
Well, and I think going into that, making sure that we have a robust policy about when they can go to the scene versus when they can't go to the scene. We certainly don't want a privately owned vehicle on an interstate or a high traffic area. And if we do allow that, what's the staging process is like? Making sure that they're not going to be parked in a bad situation. It's not that open exposure. And we now have 10 of those people that are now parked out on the interstate.
That's all great. And also just to add that we should remind our members, if they're using their POVs for response, that technically, as far as legally concerned, that that vehicle is the same as a fire apparatus or the same as a EMS unit. The liability follows them. If they're acting on behalf of the department, the liability follows that vehicle. So it's just like they're driving a standard fleet apparatus when they're responding on that call.
Mike, you talked about POVs being one of the more under-recognized exposures. I'm going to bring up one of the more newer exposures, and that's vehicles being stolen. So how do we go about securing our apparatus? Because it's we've seen it far too often stolen from a hospital or wherever it may be. So what are we doing to secure vehicles?
Yeah, I mean the vehicle theft of an emergency vehicle is certainly on the rise in the industry. And some of the folks that we talk to, we're telling them a couple different things. But for one is secure your station. The days of leaving bay doors open on a nice warm spring day, they're kind of going by the wayside, and there's too much at risk for not only the vehicles, but the portable equipment that's on the vehicles being stolen. I mean, we hear stories all the time from our claims department with regard to incidents like that. But out in the field, make sure your vehicles, when it's unattended, make sure it's either shut down and locked, or you have a means of if there's an interlock that would disable the ignition of that vehicle. There's all types of things that are available out there in order to help with those type of exposures that exist. So yeah, it's the days of leaving your vehicle running at a scene or at a hospital or wherever, that you got to be a little bit more mindful than that. And I think we've all seen in our regions that there's an emergency vehicle stolen somewhere that we know of, and it's on the rise. And please do these things so that yours isn't the next one.
And with the 3-year lead time to get an apparatus, it's not a good time to lose one.
No, absolutely not.
So why is it important for an organization to monitor daily practices compared to the written guidelines?
I think it's important because you want to validate your policies and procedures. It's going to give you benchmarks to make sure that the organization is meeting the intended compliance of the document, making sure that the employees understand the document, and it's making sure that that document is meeting what the overall needs of the organizations are.
So what other tools are available to assist our clients, with this process?
Chris, one of the things that's available in today's industry is driver monitoring systems. There's a lot of large fleets and even smaller fleets now that the cost to do these things is much more economical, and certainly these things will assist organization leadership with understanding truly what's going on behind the wheel of their vehicles. And the idea behind it is more of a proactive coaching than it is to take that data and use it as a Monday morning quarterback to, hey, let's go to the film and see what happened on that particular incident. So if you can coach the drivers into the proper behaviors, which are outlined in your SOP, SOGs, boy, then that's a real win to improving and establishing the overall safety culture of that organization.
And to echo Mike's point, I agree with the driver monitoring systems, but to use it as a positive, not just a punitive measure, because there's a lot of goodwill that can come from drivers getting competitive, wanting to have the higher scores. So it is good to monitor the drivers and to monitor their driving habits, but also just don't make it strictly punitive if you're going to have that system.
And, Chris, to add to you and to Mike, the proactive use, but also proactive versus reaction. Okay, we're going to have a driver monitoring system, and the only time we're going to look at it is when we have an event, versus using the dashboard or using whatever tools come with the program that allow you to evaluate each driver potentially as a driver report card, scoring your drivers, and actually even almost gamifying it. And I'm stealing a term from Mike, but make it a competition. If you've got the top 10 drivers and number 11 wants to be number 1, how do they get there? And it lets them see what other people are doing.
Yeah, there's a lot of goodwill that can come out of a $15 Starbucks card just by breeding competition to win that. So we typically round out the episodes with chatting about some of the resources that we have available. So what resources are available to assist an organization in establishing their own SOPs for vehicle operations?
Of course, Mike, Chris, on our website, we have the sample EVRS guidelines that they can use. Also, a complementary document to that as well is the sterile cab communique that's on that website as well. That's another concept that can be interjected into your organization, and it's something that came from the airline division, and we've kind of tailored it to go to there. Sterile cab has been around for a little while, and it's also something that you can use to help enhance your guidelines as well.
So I kind of want to circle back to one of the questions that we asked earlier, because a couple of points came to mind that I think they're important to talk about. Blair, you just talked about the sterile cab concept, but what about response speeds? I mean, how do we need to treat those?
So, you look at the size of the vehicles we're driving, whether it's an ambulance at 12, 14,000 pounds or an engine or an aerial at, several tons, 20, 30 tons. These vehicles do not stop quickly. So our guideline truly is drive as close to the posted speed limit as possible, using due regard, understanding that various states have different rules for emergency vehicle operations. But from a due regard standpoint and from a driving as close to the posted speed limit, it gives us more control of those vehicles.
Yeah, the other thing to add on the response speed side is there's factors that you have to consider whenever you're running one of these vehicles. What's the road condition, slippery road condition? What's the condition of the road just as a general maintenance? What's the surface of the road? Inclement weather, poor visibility, congested traffic, sharp curves. All those things play a factor into the appropriate response speed for your vehicle.
How do all those things play into rollover prevention?
Chris, one of the key things and one of the larger losses we see besides intersections is rollovers. usually ends up with a total loss of a vehicle, and generally the crew members are going to get hurt, including maybe some third-party bystanders or property as well. So the key for rollover is having an adequate rollover prevention program and a step-by-step process to describe the proper actions an operator should take in the event that they have a rollover situation or are going to potentially be into a rollover situation. So this includes taking their foot off the accelerator, drifting to a slowed, controlled speed, and then once they get to that safe speed or complete stop, they can then bring the vehicle back onto the road surface. And these are usually found in stuff like soft shoulders, things of that nature is really what get these drivers into, or tight roadways, is what get these drivers into these situations.
So, Mike, I think it's really important to talk about some of the vehicle dynamics in that aspect. So there is a lot of technology that's designed to help with that rollover prevention. And I think it's really important that the drivers, specifically in the driver training process, know how that vehicle is going to respond when it triggers one of those events. So, some of the older vehicles, it's designed to slowly start to slow that vehicle down, versus the newer style vehicles, it's a very abrupt process. And that could be very intimidating and scary for a new driver, which could actually create more problems because they're not sure how that vehicle is responding. They don't understand it very well. So I think in that orientation process to the vehicle, it is absolutely imperative that we take the time to talk about that sway prevention, that rollover prevention system that's integrated into the vehicle, if it is integrated to that vehicle.
Well, we kind of jumped around a little bit, but I'm glad we came back and hit those points because it was something very important to hit on. Brian wants to say something else.
So one more thing to talk about is warning devices and true emergencies. And I think it's important to really understand this concept because we hear so many times or see so many times that people respond to calls, especially in the overnight hours where they're turning the lights on, they're not using the sirens. That is only asking for problems. In the event that we're involved in an incident, lights on, no sirens on, we're almost always going to be at fault for that incident. So it's important, if we're using those devices, we're using them to their full intent and compliance, and we're using both together. And at the end of the day, a lot of times people think that is giving them the right of way because those lights and sirens are activated. It's not. It's asking the other drivers to yield that right of way to us. We can't force it. We can't assume that we have it. We don't have it. We've got to wait for them to give it to us.
All right, we did a little jumping around on that podcast, but I think we covered a lot of great information, and I really appreciate you all joining me. So, gentlemen, thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, sir.
And I want to thank you for listening to the program today and for your interest in VFIS safety resources. I want to thank our guests once again, Mike Baker, Blair Tyndall, Dave Bradley, and Brian DeQuinn for their time and information. Please consider subscribing to our program to stay up to date on new content releases. Also, if you like what you've heard, please consider leaving a review below. For more information about the many resources available from VFIS, please visit VFIS.com. And to submit ideas for future discussions, please reach out by email at VFISriskcontrol@VFIS.com. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this program are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Gladfelter Insurance Group, VFIS, and its employees.